So I'm going to be talking about the experience in Rojava in North Syria. And it is really quite remarkable, the similarities between what is happening in the Rojava case and the experience of the Zapatistas in Mexico, as Gilberto has just outlined. And in many ways, I think, what we will see in the presentation of the Rojava example is, practically speaking, in terms of structures and operations, how do those principles of self-government and direct democracy and communitarianism actually translate into systems and operations on the ground? So in a funny way, we didn't plan this, but in a way, this is part two of Gilberto's presentation. It's a complementary presentation, really, to the more theoretical, in a way, articulation of the principles of direct democracy and communitarianism that Gilberto presented in the case of the Zapatistas in Mexico. So the title of the presentation being the Rojava Revolution, Cooperation, Environmentalism, and Feminism in the North Syria Democratic Federation. The North Syria Democratic Federation is now the formal name of Rojava, which translated, Rojava simply means West Kurdistan. So I visited Rojava just a little over 1 year ago. And I had been following the story of Rojava for some time. And I found the opportunity to visit as part of the work that I do as executive director for the Community Evolution Foundation, which is based in Vancouver. And so I went to Rojava. And the question perhaps I would like to begin with is, why Rojava and why now? Why is this important? And I had three reasons, in a way, for my compulsion to visit. One is the urgent need for a new imaginary. We are in a moment of dire crisis, politically, economically, socially, environmentally, globally. And in so many ways, conferences like this and in many others that I and many of you have been a part of are struggling for articulating a new imaginary that can act as a propulsive force and as an articulation for a new way of thinking about political economy and how to organize societies and communities in a way that is sustainable and humane. What does this imaginary look like? There are small and diverse and multiple examples of how this can be expressed, but I felt that Rojava was a particularly compelling and well-developed articulation of a new imaginary. Second, we need to find ways to apply our cooperative and social values and principles to scales of comprehensive system change. It is no longer sufficient for us as practitioners, as academics, as militants, to be thinking about ideas like cooperation and the social values and economic values that cooperatives in particular embody as isolated and disconnected elements within a larger, shall we say, neoliberal capitalist framework. We need to reimagine these values and these principles systemically and comprehensively as a formulation and an articulation of a new form of political economy. That is the challenge. Rojava, I think, points a direction towards what this articulation of a new political economy might look like. And finally, we need to learn and apply the lessons of vanguard movements, sometimes in the strangest and most unlikely places. Rojava is one of those very unlikely places, given what has been occurring in Syria over the last 7 years. When we talk about Syria and the ongoing devastation and war that is taking place there, these are the kinds of images that come to our minds. A wholesale, catastrophic destruction of an ancient culture, the pervasive destruction of violence from many sources, from the government, from the Assad regime, from the Islamic State, the militant, fanatical implementation of fundamentalist ideology, and from internecine militia groups fighting with each other for control. And so the kind of devastation that is now fixed in people's minds has formed, I think, the perspective and the vision of how people conceive of Syria today. So these are compelling and pervasive images which have formed how people understand Syria. But that is not all there is to Syria. The revolution that has taken place in Rojava is, in fact, a unique movement of both hope and healing, and shows us that there is a vision and a place within northern Syria that is a kind of refuge from those images of violence and destruction that have dominated the public perception of Syria. And so what I hope to do in this remaining time is try and describe the main features of this revolution of hope and healing. These are images, this image here and this are images that have been taken from about 5 months ago. The liberation of Raqqa, which is a town in just south of Rojava, and which had been the central command headquarters of the Islamic State in Syria, and was proclaimed by ISIS as being the center of the new caliphate that was to be created in Syria. And it was about 5 months ago that the combined forces of the Rojava self-defense units with support from the United States were able to finally liberate and expel ISIS from Raqqa. One of the primary tasks was the rescue and liberation of the women that had been sequestered and imprisoned and enslaved in Raqqa by ISIS. And it is also important to recall that the primary leading forces, armed forces for the liberation of Raqqa were the women of the YPJ, which is the military defense units composed entirely of women. And so in my conversations with some of the leadership of the YPJ when I was there, they saw the liberation of Raqqa as retribution for the enslavement and violence done against women by the Islamic State. So just to remind you, if you're not aware, this is a map of Syria, and you can see the yellow portions to the left and the top of the screen, and then the yellow portion on the right. This is a part of the traditional homeland of the Kurdish people in this area. Rojava is clearly outlined there. And in fact, the Kurdish people, Kurdistan, extends across a number of countries, Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq, all contain large numbers of Kurdish people. And this enclave in North Syria on the border of Turkey, Rojava, is the first time that the Kurdish people have been able to establish a fully autonomous region over which they exert control. So, some background, just for you to understand the historical background, which is extraordinarily compelling and explains, I think, the reasons for the emergence of Rojava and for its success too. The Syrian conflict broke out in March in 2011 when a group of students in the town of Dera were arrested and tortured for writing anti-Assad graffiti on the wall of their school. This was during the time of the Arab Spring, very shortly after the uprisings and the demonstrations in Tunisia. And this experience of popular uprisings within the other Arab states in the area was part of the inspiration, I can say, for the kind of resistance that began to be seen in Syria for the first time in many years. So what began as a peaceful and pro-democracy uprising quickly degenerated into an armed conflict when government forces responded with violence and brutal repression and armed force against demonstrators. The demonstrations were first led by families of students who were demanding the return of their sons from the prison cells and torture chambers of the Assad regime in Damascus and other areas. So what first turned into simply a demand for justice and clemency against these students evolved into a broader demand for political freedom and democracy. So traditionally, the Kurdish people in all of these states, in Syria, in Turkey, in Iraq, and in Iran, have experienced ongoing repression, marginalization, and extermination in some cases, and this was also true in Syria. What started then as a pro-democracy, peaceful pro-democracy movement has degenerated into a battlefield for a proxy war among a variety of interests in the region. The terrorists in Syria today are mostly militias funded and supported by neighboring states, by Turkey, by Iran, by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar. And of course, the Assad regime on its side has been supported by Russia. The Kurds then are among the various ethnic groups that have been caught up in this conflict. So when the war broke out, very quickly the military forces the army of the Assad regime was withdrawn from northern Syria in order to be deployed against uprisings in other parts of the country. And the Kurds in Rojava very quickly established the People's Protection Units, the YPG and the YPJ, and secured Rojava and Kobani as autonomous territories. Over the course of a number of years and intensive battles, ISIS was pushed out of the region, and the Rojava forces established a model of political economy based on the principles of communitarian direct democracy, which resemble almost exactly the values and aims of the Zapatista movement in Mexico. In Rojava, this movement and this vision of political economy and democratic communitarianism is called democratic confederalism. And so the aim of democratic confederalism is to realize a form of political economy they call stateless democracy. And so for a large part of this remaining presentation, it's an attempt to try and understand and explore what does stateless democracy actually mean and how does it actually work. Now, democratic self-government is how the governance structure of Rojava is characterized by the Kurdish people themselves. So what does it mean? Democratic self-government entails, one, a rejection of the nation state as inherently repressive, that there is no version of a nation state that is capable of resolving the problems and contradictions of patriarchy, of exploitation, of anti-democratic political culture, of violence. And so the nation state as an institution is rejected. Direct democracy, based on the formation of communal councils, very similar to the case in Mexico with the Zapatista municipal and regional councils. Federated and autonomous self-governing territories. The inclusivity of all religious and ethnic groups. This is immensely important in the conceptualization of this form of governance as being pluralistic, inclusive. And this is this may be one of the most significant accomplishments of the revolution in Rojava. This plural inclusion of all religious and ethnic groups in the area. Gender equality, the recognition and promotion of equality between genders and the role of women in the movement. Cooperative economics as the organizing form of enterprises and the economy, and participatory politics. So what we really have is democratic confederalism being, in a sense, the formal naming of what I would see as a cooperative economy and its articulation politically. So 3 points. Rojava's political economy is based on the principle of direct democracy as the organizing basis for both economics and politics. So what is significant here is the use of cooperative models, not only for the formation of individual enterprises and the operation of economic activities, but as an organizing principle for politics as well. So the foundation of this is communal control of both economic and political life. And being a unique example of community-directed democracy acting as a link between the organization of the economy and the organization of political life as an integrated system. And this, I think, is one of the most compelling lessons of the example in Rojava, which is you cannot realize a form of radical democratic political economy without integrating democracy as a principle both in the economy and in political life. So cooperative economics and cooperative political life are two complementary aspects of a single integrated system. So how does this actually come into being? How do you structurally organize this vision? Co-ops and self-directed community councils were a mechanism for doing this, and really they are the foundations of the system. So what you have then is a commune system in which the commune is conceptualized as a voluntary, self-governing organizational form, which is composed of families living in neighborhoods at the most basic level. Yeah? So you might have a group of 20 families or 30 families. Typically, that's the size of a commune in a neighborhood, and coordinating activities, collective activities for collective solving collective problems in that neighborhood. And typically, these communes will have a number of operating committees that are responsible for the management of specific issues. So the youth committee, women's committee, a defense committee, economics, health, education, and so on. These are constructed as collective forms of direct and participatory decision-making to address social collective problems in that neighborhood. This is the commune foundation for the system. And then the communes themselves select representation from the commune level to the neighborhood council. So it's a larger formulation which takes in a larger piece of territory at the neighborhood level. And then this in turn generates representation from the neighborhood commune to various larger configurations of councils up to a county council. And then finally, the county regional councils have representation that are operating at the largest level of organization and coordination, which is at the canton level. And there are 4 cantons in Rojava: Afrin, Jazeera, Kobani, and Shaba. And what is interesting also, just to go back, to these levels of organization, is that all representation of formal functions of the system of governance or of ministries, departments, or local neighborhood councils must have dual representation. One man and one woman. So all formal representative positions that have legitimate authority to act as coordinators or representatives of a collective activity have to have both a woman and a man as co-chairs. Okay? So at the level then of the cantons, the kinds of decisions that are made deal with macro organizing questions like the regional economy, agricultural production, the use and stewardship of natural resources, the conduct of foreign affairs and international relationships. These are the jurisdiction of a federal assembly and a federal council, which is elected by citizens, Kurdish people, not just Kurdish people, all the ethnic residents of the region. What is also very interesting in this system is the way in which decisions are actually formulated and carried out. Typically, in this kind of a tiered system, decisions are made at the senior level and then implemented by lower tiers of the system. What is remarkable in the Rojava case is that no decision that is taken at the senior level or at the county level is validated until it's confirmed and accepted by the lower levels. It's actually the reverse of what normally happens in a hierarchical system. So if a decision to implement a policy on agricultural production of, I don't know, corn, is taken at this level, that decision has to be validated at the point at which it is applied by the local communes. Yeah, so it's really a profound, I think, articulation of direct democracy with the grassroots and the point at which the activities that take place validates and implements only upon acceptance of a policy decision taken from the higher levels of the organization or the system. Yeah. So, how the cooperative idea and the cooperative model is implemented is really reflected in these commune systems. So communes are the means by which civil society addresses collective issues at neighborhood, local, regional, and then district levels. Cooperatives are the organizational form used to put collective solutions into practice. So as someone that has been involved in the cooperative movement in Canada and internationally for many years, to me this was really an enlightening and eye-opening experience to see how cooperative principles and organizational forms had been mobilized to coordinate and motivate people in civil society to use cooperative models for the collective solution of collective problems. So these are some examples. This is the Lauren Women's Food Cooperative. At the time I was there were probably about 30 or so members of the co-op. They were all women, and they were formed really to provide employment and to provide affordable food items, traditional food, to the local area. And you can see the examples of the food that they produce in the co-op. The cost of becoming a member of the co-op is about $50. And the members of the co-op are paid in kind. In other words, they receive a portion of the food that they produce, and this is on the basis of the amount of time that they contribute to the operation of the cooperative. And they also have a mission to provide support to families who have lost members to the battle against ISIS or against the Assad forces. So it is now this was just one example, but there are many, many examples of women's food and other forms of service cooperatives throughout Syria. This is just one. When I was there, they needed basic support for things like shelves to put these jars on. They needed a refrigerator. They had no refrigerator. So the most basic forms of support have been needed by these cooperatives because in addition to the violence in the military struggle that they are involved in, the borders of Rojava have been blockaded. There's an embargo and a blockade against trade for Rojava. Turkey has blockaded the region, and also interaction between Rojava and Iraq on the west is very, very difficult. And I'll talk about that more in a moment, but there is an embargo and a blockade of the borders of Rojava. So only the most essential medical supplies and emergency supplies are able to come into the area. So there's no trade. All of the market activities and the trading activities that sustain the economy in Rojava are 90% local. So the challenge is, how do you organize a functional economy in a region that is under siege, fighting a war, struggling to preserve ethnic and cultural recognition, and still feed the people? Here's another example of a cooperative. Kazarek Agricultural Co-op has been operating for about 2.5 years, maybe 3 years. It is on land that had been state land. It had been unproductive land. It has been granted to the cooperative to develop. It's about 5,000 hectares of land. There are about 100 or so people working in some way on the production of vegetables primarily and through the greenhouses on the co-op. But what is interesting is that the membership of the co-op is not just the workers that work in the co-op. Anyone that supports the co-op can become a member. So it's a very interesting example of what we can call open cooperation, an open cooperative system. Traditionally, a co-op, as you may know, consists of a membership of people that actually work in the co-op or directly use the services of the co-op, whether it's farmers or producers or people using the electricity of a utility co-op. It's the recipients of the co-op services that are also the members. In this case, and in many other cases, what I saw in Rojava was a form of cooperation that invited the membership and investment in the co-op by people outside of the region. So not just the workers, not just the people that utilized or used the services or goods of the co-op, but citizens or other individuals that felt solidarity with the co-op and wanted to support it, invested in it, purchased a membership share, and they might live 50 kilometers away. So this was a really interesting example of open cooperative models that were general and very common throughout the region. And as you can see, there's a variety of activities going on here. They grow corn, they have sheep, dairy production, vegetable and greenhouse production, and so on. Again, primarily to feed residents in the area. The other thing to note is that in Rojava, although the focus is on promoting cooperative models for economic development and food production, there is also the inclusion and recognition of the role and value of small and medium family enterprises which also obviously contribute to the local economy. So this also is another form of pluralism. It is not the imposition of just one form of economic model or enterprise. There is a recognition that there are a variety of forms of enterprise that have a right to operate and to exist. And family enterprises, if you go to the marketplace, for example, in Kamishlo or in other towns, you will see that most of the stores and people operating the market stalls are families or individual enterprises. They too have a role and a recognized place within the economic ecosystem of the region. So Kazrik, this all is still the agricultural co-op, Kazrik. They are now expanding. This is about 10 kilometers from the greenhouses that you saw earlier in the picture. And they are now involved in a project to irrigate this land, to pump water from the lower area up to this area, to cultivate this barren land, to reforest it. Also, there's a reforestation program that they want to implement in this area. And it is also land that previously had been deemed wasteland by the Syrian government. In other words, it was not only deemed wasteland, but Kurdish people were not allowed to produce for their own consumption. All of the production, agricultural production, that was generated in Rojava previously had to be shipped to Damascus and to the municipalities and productive centers of Syria for processing and distribution there. So it was a form of internal exploitation that benefited the Assad regime to the cost of the Kurdish people in that region. So this is really the first time that they've been able to establish a self-governing economic production system. Yeah. The other thing to understand about this region is that it is very rich in oil. Rojava is on top of some of the richest oil fields in Syria. And so I don't have pictures here, but when I was there, I was traveling around, you can see these oil derricks all over the landscape, all of them rusting and inactive because there's no place to sell the oil. It's very, you can't produce the oil and then sell it, outside of Rojava. So the democratic administrative system is forced to use diesel for supplying power, to the cities and the towns. And the presence of oil in this area is, of course, very attractive to other powers in the area. So oil and access to the oil is one of the reasons why there's such an intense interest in eliminating the Kurdish self-governing system in the area, as usual. And then finally, this is an organization called Girton, which means solidarity, a solidarity co-op. The co-op's mission is to provide logistical and organizational support to other co-ops in Rojava. In other words, it's a second-tier co-op. The agricultural co-op, Lauren's Women's Co-op, or the Kazrik Agricultural Co-op being primary co-ops. And then Girton is a second-tier co-op that provides logistical support for the purchase of inputs, supplies, training, information, all the kinds of supportive institutional structures that help the lower or the primary co-ops operate. The idea for Girton actually came out of discussions in one of the local communes to try and establish a cooperative to support logistically the operations of co-ops in that local area. And it became so popular that it was replicated now, and Girton is the largest cooperative in Rojava with operations across the entire region. Okay, so what we have is an integral approach based on the principles of community economic development, which is territorial and community-driven development. We have the cooperative model of economic democracy, and we have democratic self-government, which is communal direct democracy. All three methodologies are integrated within a single comprehensive vision of systemic change. So the model is civil organizations directing development. And there are a number of civil organizations that are central to the operation of the system. TEVDEM is probably the most important. TEVDEM is an organization that is separate from the governance structures of Rojava, but is really an organization that includes and mobilizes all primary actors within civil society. So organizations that represent political parties are represented in TEVDEM. Organizations that represent ethnic and religious interests have membership in TEVDEM. So TEVDEM really is a kind of hard to describe, an autonomous, influential, civil organization that mobilizes, trains citizens for the application of these principles in a day-to-day way, in their daily lives, and also promotes and develops policies for the self-administration. So it is really quite a remarkable experiment in pluralism. In how do you actually include and mobilize a variety of interests within civil society around common collective aims. And these are both economic and political. Congreya Star is the women's federation in Rojava. All women are automatically members of Congreya Star, and it is very active not only in promoting and empowering women to take roles in political life, but also in economic life. So, for example, they are very active in the promotion of women's co-ops, like the Lauren Women's Co-op, as I mentioned earlier. And of course, there's the federated communes. These communes that are federated within this kind of interconnected, nested system of self-governing and direct democracy organizations from the commune up to the canton. So recently is about just about 7 or 8 months ago, the Rojava Founding Council, which is the kind of the political sort of engine of the system, passed 4 declarations with respect to its management system in Rojava. One, that 60% of representatives in the national parliament will be elected directly by voters through ballot boxes, and those elections took place about 4 months ago. 40% of the parliament seats will be reserved for minorities via a quota system. That there must be equal participation of men and women, and that each member of the parliament and the councils is entitled to run for elections for 2 terms. So what we have then is the formal institutionalization of plurality and gender equality within the system. Yeah. Now, there have been a number of new developments over the course of the last year. First, there had been, with the liberation of Raqqa, the defeat of ISIS in Syria. So by most accounts, the existence of ISIS in Syria had all but been eliminated, largely through the military activities of the defense units of Rojava. But there has also been a referendum in Kurdistan region of Iraq. There is a very different kind of setup of political setup among the Iraqis, among the Kurdish people on the borders of Iraq. And they passed a referendum about 4 months ago, I think it was, declaring autonomy in the area. And this has destabilized a lot of the progressive work that has been established in Rojava. It has provoked a reaction among the neighboring states. This has been viewed not very favorably by the Rojava administration in Syria. There has now evolved an agreement, an embargo agreement between Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. And of course, the most important development has been the invasion of Afrin, which is one of the cantons in Rojava, by Turkey. Turkey invaded Afrin about 2.5 months ago. They had declared that the presence of the Kurdish military units in Afrin constituted a terrorist threat to Turkey, and they used this as a pretext to invade. Since that time, there's been a process of ongoing ethnic cleansing and genocide taking place in Afrin. Afrin had been a refuge for many outside refugees coming to seek security in Rojava, not just by Kurds, but by many other ethnic groups that had been displaced by the wars in Iraq and Syria. So now, once again, many of these people have been expelled or are seeking refuge in other parts of Rojava. It is unclear whether Turkey will be satisfied with simply the occupation of Afrin, or whether they will extend the invasion to eradicate the self-administration and democratic confederalism in the rest of Rojava. My view is that if Turkey finds an opportunity to do so, they will invade the rest of Syria. Not Syria, the rest of Rojava. The only thing that is really preventing the extension of the invasion beyond Afrin by Turkey is the presence of the United States, because the United States has been operating as an ally to the Kurdish forces in their battle against ISIS. What is very unclear is what role the United States will play going forward. So, yeah, this is just a shot of a Turkish tank that is entering Afrin. So, there are a number of preconditions that we can point to for the success of Rojava so far. One is the opening of a political space for revolution occasioned by the Syrian conflict. If the Syrian conflict had not taken place and the uprising against the Assad regime had not provided a political and sort of territorial space for the application of this model in Rojava, the Rojava Revolution would not have been possible. There is a solidarity of purpose occasioned by ethnic and cultural struggle and collective identity. So many of the factors that have given rise to self-government among indigenous groups, such as the example provided by the Zapatistas in Mexico, apply also here, which is the collective urge to realize and promote ethnic and cultural identity, which has been under threat and repressed by Syria for many years. There is a clarity of vision and purpose facilitated by the power of Abdullah Öcalan's idea. Abdullah Öcalan was is in a sense the spiritual and political mentor or leader of the Rojava Revolution. I guess he plays a similar kind of role as Marco did, in the Zapatista movement. Abdullah Öcalan is, no, you're shaking your head. Is that true or not true? It's not true. Okay. Okay. But he is certainly a political and sort of ideological leader for Rojava, Öcalan. Öcalan is currently in a Turkish jail. He was one of the founders of the Kurdish Workers' Party in Turkey. He was, more or less a conventional Marxist in terms of his political ideas, but radically changed his political philosophy after having encountered the work of Murray Bookchin in the United States and the introduction of both environmentalism and communitarianism as key elements of a new formulation of political economy. So this reformulation of traditional Marxist ideology into a communitarian, self-governing, and I would say somewhat anarchistic formulation of socialism has been the guiding political philosophy for the Rojava Revolution. The organization of military capacity and the ability to defend their achievements. If it were not for the military units, Rojava would have been exterminated many years ago. And then finally, the correlation of cooperative ideas with traditional values and cultural practices. One of the things that was astonishing to me was how quickly these changes have taken place. That the extension of the cooperative idea into everyday life and production systems in Rojava happened very rapidly. And what was also quite astonishing to me was the degree to which the articulation of this vision of political economy has been so pervasive among everyday people that I encountered in these cooperatives. I would ask them, why are you doing this? And, what's the significance of the co-op? And why are you a member? And so on like that. And I consistently found a passionate commitment to these ideas and practices at all levels that I encountered in Rojava. And I think this is in part because the traditional operations of Kurdish village life are still very much alive in the culture. So the application of these more formal cooperative ideas and models found already foundation in a seedbed in the traditional cooperative forms of Kurdish social relationships in traditional village life in the area. So there was a complementarity between this political vision and the traditional cooperative social and political relationships that have been operating for millennia in the village life of the Kurdish people. So what are the lessons? One, that comprehensive, large-scale cooperative political economy is possible. That integrating economic with political democracy within a single system is crucial. And this is this twinning and integration of economic cooperation with political operation and political life through the application of these ideas, cooperative ideas. Systems building from the grassroots upward, through organizing civil institutions like TEVDEM and Congrès Star, that the mobilizing work and the leadership and the education work is not top-down, it comes from the grassroots up. The central role of plural and multi-interest institutions, collaborating within these collective civil organizations to seek collective solutions that do not simply exclude or privilege one political or ethnic group over another. There is a clear social, cultural, economic, and political vision that has been articulated and expounded throughout this process. There is comprehensive education and training at communal, political, and institutional levels. So TEVDEM in particular has been very active in training both organizers and members of these cooperatives and communes to operate. And there's obviously a crucial need for international solidarity. That, unlike the example of the Zapatistas in Mexico, there is very little awareness internationally of what is happening in Rojava. The revolution in Rojava and what has been accomplished here has been eclipsed by the macro military and economic issues that have been on the front page news, concerning the larger military struggles and the civil war in Syria. So there is a huge need for international understanding and solidarity for what is happening. So Rojava, I believe, encourages us to think big, to have hope, and to understand that alternatives exist, that the paradigms we live in are not set in stone, that it is possible to build a democratic and cooperative political economy where peace, equality, and communities come first. And that Rojava is one example of how this can happen in the most difficult circumstances, where the struggle for existence is happening simultaneously with the struggle to reimagine a form of social and political life that is humane, and that reaffirms, the kind of direct democracy and social values that we've been articulating. Now, there are a number of risks. Internal risks. There's the risk of intolerance of dissent. Because of the crisis situation, there was always a sensitivity to dissent that may give rise to division and destabilizing, in a sense, the solidarity of the movement. The emergence of competing influences from other actors, right? So ethnic and religious minorities, other political movements that see in Rojava an opportunity to extend their own particular interests. There is a huge need for training, education of leadership, and in particular for technical assistance. All of these cooperative enterprises need specific technical training for their dairy farms, for the agricultural production, for the management of their municipal systems, transportation systems, and so on. There's a huge need for technical training and education. And the challenges of transitioning from a war economy to a sustainable peace economy. Now, external risks include competition and conflict within broader Kurdish community. There are serious political divisions and differences within the Kurdish community across this region. So the political leadership and the political model that has been promoted, for example, by the KDP in Iraq is in direct opposition to the stateless democracy that is being promoted in Rojava. Yeah? The reaction of Iran, Iraq, Turkey etc., to the declaration of the Kurdish independence in Iraq is a political risk. The invasion, of course, of Afrin by Turkey, which means in turn an increased dependence by Rojava on the United States. And this dependence, of course, is unstable, but we're talking about Trump. We're talking about a Trump administration which is unpredictable, to say the least. And so what value and what can be relied upon in terms of an alliance with the United States? Huge risk. And the increased influence of non-governmental organizations. I was talking to a friend of mine that just recently returned from Rojava about a week ago, and he pointed out that the presence and operations of NGOs is proving to be an additional risk to Rojava because they are extracting a price, a political price, for their support of the work that they're doing, with Rojava. So that's an external risk. So the main point is that the model that is now being implemented in Rojava shows a way to humanize our political economy by reconnecting social values to the marketplace, radically extending democratic practice, and mobilizing civil society to realize this vision. Yeah? But I have a question, and it relates to this question of the state, the role of the state, and the attempt now to create a form of stateless democracy. The question is there any form of state that can catalyze and support this process of humanizing the economy? And I have been, over the last couple of years, reflecting on the possibility of something like a partner state that could be capable of playing this kind of a transformative role. So the question is there the possibility of something like a partner state that the experience of Rojava gives us some clues in terms of how it might operate? And I'll close with this because I think this is a subject for discussion. The partner state playing the role of an enabling state whose purpose is to facilitate the mobilization of civil society for the production of social goods in service to the common good. So it means the coordination, not control, of collective action, the practice of generative democracy as opposed to passive democracy, so citizenship conceived as a verb rather than as a noun, the democratization of government through the cooperatization of government operations and services. So this is one of the issues I raised yesterday in terms of how to deal with the pervasive problem of bureaucracy, the creation of an equitable balance between state, civil, and commercial power, and the promotion and institutionalization of cooperative economy and cooperative markets. So the experiment in stateless democracy taking place now in Rojava may be an emerging model for a cooperative partner state. And this brings me back to a point that was raised in one of the slides that Gilberto provided, which is that the Zapatista experience is not conceived as an example leading to a new formulation of state, of a nation state, right? So this is a question for me. Does the experience of the Rojava model give us an idea or a model for reconceptualizing the state in a completely different way? So, thank you. Hope this has been of some interest to you, and I look forward to our discussion.